Wolverine's mask should look absolutely ridiculous. If you actually describe it out loud, it sounds like something that should fall apart the second you put it onto a real person. You got these enormous black fins coming off the side of his head, completely white eyes, bright yellow wrapped around the face, and then you just leave Hugh Jackman's mouth and beard sticking out underneath it. It should look like cheap cosplay. But when he finally puts the mask on in Deadpool Wolverine, I don't think it does. And the obvious explanation is that Marvel finally stopped being embarrassed by the comics and just gave Wolverine a comic accurate mask. Except, there's a problem with that. What exactly does comic accurate actually mean? Because Wolverine's mask hasn't even had one fixed design in the comics. When he first appeared, the ears were actually much smaller, and the mask even had these strange whisker details around the mouth. Then Dave Cockrum redesigned them when Wolverine joined the X-Men in Giant Size X-Men, extended those black ears dramatically, and removed the whiskers entirely. That much more exaggerated version eventually became the image that most of us think when we picture Wolverine. And since then, different artists have pushed those shapes all over the place. Sometimes the ears are relatively restrained, sometimes they're just enormous. So simply copying the comic was never really an option. Someone still had to decide which version of that exaggeration could actually sit on Hugh Jackman's head. And I think this is where live action design gets kind of clever. Look at those black fins. They're still big enough that if I filled Wolverine's entire head in as a black silhouette, you would probably recognize him immediately. That shape has to survive, there's no doubt about that. But they haven't taken one of the most extreme comic versions and literally bolted those proportions onto a human skull. They pulled them back just enough and the shape flows backwards with his head rather than completely dominating it. So you get that aggressive Wolverine silhouette without spending the whole scene staring at just two enormous pieces of costume sticking out of Hugh's head. And apparently getting those proportions right was genuinely part of the fitting process. Costume designer Graham Churchyard has talked about how they were adjusting the proportions of the costume during those early fittings, and decided the first time they completed the look with the mask as a huge moment for the team. I actually think the most important part of the mask is the bit they don't cover, because Wolverine still needs Hugh Jackman's face. Not all of it, but just enough of it. If you covered his mouth and jaw as well, you'd probably just get a cleaner superhero mask, but I think you'd lose Logan himself. So much of Wolverine's personality comes through his teeth, his beard, the tension in his jaw, and the way he snarls when he's angry. The mask gives you those completely artificial comic book eyes up here, but underneath them they still have the real actor doing all of the work. And I think that's the balance that stops it becoming a costume just for costume's sake. The top half turns Hugh Jackman into an icon, and the bottom half still lets him be Wolverine and Logan. And that distinction becomes really important when you translate comic designs into live action, because comic artists are allowed to cheat constantly. Those fins can get bigger because the panel needs a stronger silhouette. The white eyes can change shape depending on the expression, and his head underneath the mask doesn't really have to obey the proportions of an actual piece of material wrapped around a human skull. A physical costume doesn't have that luxury. Suddenly, somebody has to decide how big those shapes really are, and where they sit, and how they move with the actor, and whether Hugh Jackman can still look intimidating once he's actually wearing the costume. That's why I don't think the achievement here is simply Marvel finally made Wolverine comic book accurate. I think they worked out what the comics could afford to exaggerate, kept the parts that make Wolverine instantly recognizable, and then adapted everything around the real human face. And that is a much harder design problem, because if you pull those shapes back too far, you end up with something technically believable that doesn't really feel like Wolverine anymore. Push them too far, and suddenly the exact thing fans have spent 20 years asking to see becomes the reason nobody wants to take the scene seriously. This sits right in the middle. It still looks absurd when you break it down into individual pieces, but once they're together, you just see Wolverine. And I think that's why the mask works so well. Not because they copied the comic perfectly, they understood which parts they couldn't afford to lose. So I'm curious, do you think they finally nailed Wolverine's mask in live action? Or is there a comic version you think they should push even further? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.